Good morning, afternoon, or evening to our audience around the world, and a very warm welcome to this RICS webinar of the World Built Environment Forum. For those who are new in these webinars, we are here to advance discussions of critical importance to the built and natural environment, inspiring positive and sustainable change, and providing the audience with the best contemporary thinking. Today, we will speak about natural solutions to human-induced problems, with a particular focus on the role of data in moving towards a nature-positive built environment. My name is Cristina Gomez. I lead the agenda on urban nature-based solutions at the World Economic Forum, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here today with 4 experts that will be sharing a wealth of knowledge on the growing efforts of countries such as the UK to enact biodiversity-related legislation, as well as the growing efforts of key stakeholders operating in the built and natural environment in declaring nature-positive commitments and setting biodiversity targets. I will briefly present each of our very special guests today before delving into what I can anticipate will be a very rich discussion. So I will start with Roland Hunziker. I invite you, Roland, to turn on your camera, please. Hello, Roland. So Roland is Director of Built Environment and member of the Extended Leadership Group at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where he engages and supports companies to drive the transition to a net zero carbon, circular, and nature-positive built environment. Roland is also co-chair of the steering committee of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, Global ABC, and is also a co-initiator of the City Business Climate Alliance, CBCA, a partnership with C40 and CDP to drive climate action in cities. Roland is joining us from Switzerland, his home country. So welcome, Roland, to this panel.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you.
Now I welcome Fiona Mannix. Fiona is a senior specialist on land and resources at RICS, where she leads the agenda on standards and guidance for professional groups and surveyors operating in the rural and land sectors. Her core areas of work and publications include valuation of rural property and woodlands, renewable energy, natural capital, and environmental risks. And before joining RICS and changing her career path following postgraduate studies in rural development, Fiona worked as an accountant across other sectors, including oil and gas. So Fiona will be speaking us today particularly about the role of land for net nature positive, and she's joining us from the UK. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Cristina.
Now the turn is for Tom Butterworth. Tom is head of ecology at WSP UK, where he supports public and private sector organizations in achieving their development objectives while meeting natural capital and nature positive standards. Tom has led net positive measures and outcomes across many high-profile projects, particularly in the energy, road, and rail sectors. He has over 23 years of experience working for wildlife, including the management of protected areas sites and different sites across the UK, and the development of local, regional, and national biodiversity strategies and policies. He also led several biodiversity research programs and managed the delivery of England's biodiversity strategy. Tom, welcome to the panel.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
And last but not least, we have the second Thomas Coulson. Thomas, I invite you to turn on your camera, please. Thomas is sector lead of facilities management and managing agents at Ground Control, where he provides active solutions of external spaces and areas of the built environment across the UK. Core areas of work and services include grounds and winter maintenance, tree management, and landscape construction. Thomas not only has experience in the real estate industry, but is also chartered surveyor and certified member of the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management. And he and his team are involved through Ground Control in a rewilding project at the Wildfell Centre for Environmental Recovery, a 300-acre site in Essex dedicated to helping landowners unlock the potential of their underutilized land for nature's recovery. Thomas, the second, welcome to this panel.
Thanks for having me.
So before starting our discussion, I would like to remind and encourage our audience to raise questions on the chat. As we want this discussion to be very active and interactive. I would ask also our guests speakers to feel free and include any of these questions in the replies and wave a discussion that is more informal. So let's kickstart with the ecologists in the room. Welcome, Thomas, again. I think that here we are very lucky to have you, and I would like to start with you because there's a very complex question that we all ask ourselves, and is how to measure nature. We are ahead of the COP15 in Montreal, where targets are yet to be agreed on. How are we measuring nature? How are we approaching nature? And what is the data that we can use to measure nature as a complex system? So, Tom, can you share some insights around the work that you've done and the importance of measuring nature through very concrete and simple methods?
Thank you so much, Cristina, and lovely to be here. You're absolutely right. Measuring nature is really complicated. And if we look at the journey we've been on for climate and climate change and measuring change in carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, we can see a really clear journey there. And the energy and direction that's created by having a single relatively simple to describe target of net zero carbon. Now, of course, there's a whole load of work that goes on behind that, and it's not just about carbon either. But even though that is actually quite a complex target, right? Biodiversity and nature provide something many times more complex. The reason for that is that we can understand how you might be able to get a net zero target for an organization or a country. You can even think about a sandwich that might be net zero. There's no equivalent for biodiversity. You can't have a nature positive target that's the same at a country level or at a company level, and you certainly that doesn't necessarily make much sense at a level of a sandwich. So what we're seeing in COP is a whole range of targets, 22 targets being put forward, and we've got a draft of those targets. They'll be discussed in Montreal over December, and hopefully a strong agreement will come out of that. And it's those targets together, delivering all of those together, that will result in the positive outcome for nature. And there we're talking about biodiversity, the interactions between the species species themselves, the plants and animals, fungi, etc. But also air, the soils, the water. That's all part of the ecosystems that we're needing to restore. So the targets in the COP, the draft text that's been set out, include targets like 30 by 30, which is about protecting 30% of our land and sea by 2030, targets for minimizing maximizing nature-based solutions, so using nature to provide benefits for us, not just climate benefits, but social benefits as well, minimizing subsidies that are harming the natural environment. And one that's very important for me, which is target 15, which is around businesses reporting on their impacts on nature and decreasing their impacts. And I'm really hopeful that we'll have a strong, clear target there as well. Now, all of those together, as I've already said, set out what nature positive looks like, but none of them are going to apply to all organizations, and that's really quite complex. The 30 by 30 target isn't going to apply to, I don't know, a highways organization in England, because it's not appropriate to think about protecting 30% of their land. It's about 30% of the land that's appropriate to protect across the globe. At land and sea, I should say. And so we need to think quite carefully about what targets are right for each company. Now, what that leads to is that we need to think about our direct impacts and our supply chain and value chain. And this is where data becomes really crucial, because we must start to understand those direct impacts using things like remote sensing, the drone technologies that we're using now, as well as people on the ground assessing what's actually happening ecologically. But we also need to be able to track that through the supply chain, where we might start thinking about using things like blockchain to track impacts across the supply chain, because location is crucial. Where the impacts happen is really, really vital. And that's quite different from some of the climate pieces, where carbon emission anywhere will have impacts globally. If you're losing forests in a certain place, that's going to have a direct impact on the flood risk, the air quality, and the livelihoods of those people in that local area. And then knock-on effects will be global. So location is crucial, which is why things like blockchain are going to be really crucial as well. And then we've got a whole load of other pieces in that including, for example, eDNA, using environmental DNA to gather information on the species present, measure change to ecosystems, but also indicate presence of some of our rarer species, which can be really important in informing what actions we need to take locally. That all links up with the science-based targets for nature and task force for nature-related financial disclosure, both of which are working hard to try and set out what all of this might mean for businesses and understand how we might report on that. But the data is going through a revolution at the same time as the target's going through a revolution. And so it really is a very exciting and very changing environment to be working in.
Thanks, Tom. Lots of insights there. And let's change from a data revolution to a sectoral revolution. So, Roland, I will invite you. You at WCBSD work with the world's leading sustainable businesses and have a very strong community-based approach. So I would like to ask you first to share what has been the work behind building this nature positive concept, and also to add in there, what do you think is the greatest challenge to move from working with front runners, as the one that you work with, to a whole movement, sectoral movement towards a nature positive sectoral transition, including the big majority of companies operating in the built environment sector? You're on mute, Roland. Still on mute.
How is it now?
Better.
Yes, okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I pressed the wrong button. Still happens after all this time. Thank you very much for giving me a moment to introduce this. And just maybe, why am I here? As you say, in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we're working with global companies on sustainability, and we're helping them across 3 global imperatives for business action, which is obviously the climate crisis, it's nature loss, and mounting inequality. And all these companies take commitments to have clear policies and targets across all 3 dimensions. So nature positive is one of the key commitments member companies make. And as Tom said, it's a very complex endeavor. So what I wanted to briefly update you on is recent developments on business and nature positive to set the scene. So what we see here is a publication with Business for Nature, where many of us have contributed, also World Economic Forum, WBCSD, WWF, and many others, that nature positive is a global goal. It's a systemic goal to halt, reverse nature loss by 2030 and full recovery by 2050. So what is important here, I will not focus on everything, but on the bottom right, that companies start assessing, committing, and transforming and disclosing their impacts and dependencies, but that they see that as a contribution to nature positive, not necessarily, at least for now, claiming to be nature positive themselves because of the complexity. And I think that is important because we're seeing in the net zero carbon debate some issues with, what are those claims and what can we actually claim? So I think this is a very important global message for all of us to be aware we're contributing to this global goal. Maybe next slide. Thank you. So how can business contribute towards this? And here we're speaking of the mitigation hierarchy, which I think many of us are very familiar with. Of course, avoiding and reducing nature loss, that is, do less harm. But then moving towards restoring and regenerating natural ecosystems and ultimately transform. As Tom mentioned as well, how do we work with our whole sphere of influence and across our value chain? And that is where, with these roadmaps, we are now starting to help different sectors addressing the nature positive topic. Next slide. These nature positive roadmaps are built on the work you led at the forum about 2 years ago with that landmark report around global nature, and really focusing on the land sector, so food and ag, energy, as well as built environment. And the work we do builds on the Science-Based Targets Network, as well as TNFD, and working closely together with these networks as well, as we go about assessing, prioritizing, committing, measuring, and then acting and ultimately disclosing. So the work of the roadmaps is really to help business navigate this space and take those global targets, make them actionable, and really help them in their actions. And also, what are the specific KPIs they should use? So I thought it's important for us to have this in mind as these different organizations are working together to have that global language, have a global definition and common measurement, so that we can then really help businesses along their value chains. And just the last slide, very briefly, and then I'll close the introduction, is really to help with that shared definition. So our work in my team is focusing on the built environment. How do we help companies along the full value chain with this common language, and how do we support them in starting to set their own goals and working with others? And maybe in terms of the challenges, we can come to that in the discussion, but maybe I'll let first others contribute as well. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you, Roland. Yeah, lots of challenges there. Now I would like to turn it to the second Tom. I think that you can share with us some insights on this aspiration to become nature positive from one company particularly that shares this nature positive vision that, as far as I know, Ground Control has set a target to achieve net zero by 2050, but also is integrating biodiversity into its full value chain. So I like that we can get very concrete here. And we in our fields, we have been witnesses of incredible aspirational goals for nature since the Earth Summit in 1992, and we are still discussing what Tom B shared at the very beginning. So we are facing the challenges Roland was sharing to go beyond goodwill and providing a framework step by step, sector by sector, on how to drive this transition. So Thomas, I would like to ask you, how can those ambitious goals for nature be translated into concrete actions from your experience in your company? And what does it mean to be nature positive from an infrastructure company point of view and in very practical terms?
Okay, thank you for that. I think for us, kind of building in what Roland said and what Tom B said, it's about the art of the possible, because I think when you take the challenge, it's very complex, it's very big. If you start by benchmarking and understand what you're doing now, you see both positives and see opportunities and the issues, so you can see what you can capitalize on very, very quickly. And I think something as complex as this, you can actually see straight away, like Tom was mentioning about, you know, his sort of sandwich theory. It's actually small wins. You've got easy marginal gains, easy opportunities. You can go, right, we're doing this good, let's then build on that. So for us as a business, yes, we are in that blockchain, in that supply chain, but ultimately, if we can align our goals and align our strategies, then we can do more good quicker. So I think it's about educating, it's about understanding we're in it together, and we are the solution. So we strive for human nature at its best. And for us as a business, we really wanted to kind of understand those challenges, which is why we went into Wildfell. So we're experiencing it ourselves before we're going out into the world and go, right, this is what we can do, this is what we can offer our customers. And what's very interesting in that is, like you were saying, Roland, those roadmaps become very clear from the outset, and you can build them very structured, and you can metricate it, which I think is really important. And that's when you create that necessity for the toolkits, for the measuring, for the aspects that's going to help you achieve those goals. So I think in summary, yes, it's a big challenge, but it's the art of the possibles there. We can do it. And what's exciting is that there's big wins, there's small wins, and there's medium wins. And I think if you bridge that in your roadmap and you work together collectively with that blockchain, I'm really excited and confident that you can achieve good things.
Great, thank you, Tom. I like this subject about blockchain and new technologies. We can come to this after. Now, Fiona, your experience in the rural context is a great complement here. I think we must definitely reconcile this relationship or bridge this gap between the built environment and the rural environment. And you are at the very intersection, and you have been leading the work around standards, solutions, and mechanisms that are being developed in UK to drive nature positive transition, particularly in what you call rural land-based enterprise. So I would like you to share, what do you see are the key challenges and potential impacts that lie ahead of these, for these rural businesses to become actually nature positive, and what does it mean in a rural landscape, in a rural environment, and in rural land-based businesses?
Yeah, thank you, Cristina. I like the opening introduction about the fact that everything we're dealing with here has both a local impact and a global impact, and I think that that's a very important point. So whatever happens on land impacts the locality in which that land is situated, but then obviously goes on to have a higher regional, countrywide and global impact as well. So I think that's very important, because it does put a focus on what actions are needed on the ground, as it were. And I think it's very important that we link through the built environment to land, that they are not separate, that they're very much intertwined. And I'd like to highlight one example that we have in the UK at the moment, whereby we are taking action to link through what happens in the built environment with what happens with the land. And that is an initiative that's come through legislation in the UK, specifically in England, in the Environment Act, where we're now looking at mandating something we're terming biodiversity net gain, which means that within the planning system from November 23, it will be mandated that every development as part of their planning application is going to have to create a 10% biodiversity net gain. It's quite complicated, so I won't go into the specifics of it. It will work through a mitigation hierarchy that's already been referenced. It's quite a common philosophy now that we adopt a mitigation hierarchy perspective to many of these things. And it will also work through the need to try and deal with the biodiversity net gain on site within the development that's been proposed. If it can't be done, then one can move to off-site. And if not, then biodiversity credits can be purchased. So it has a hierarchy as well that it goes through besides the mitigation hierarchy. So complicated stuff, but a very good initiative and a very good example of what can be done on the ground. And that will create a lot of opportunities for landowners specifically. So we will see landowners now taking advantage of those opportunities, and we will see net nature results on land as a result of that legislation coming through the planning system. I wanted to highlight it specifically. It's a very good example of something that's going to happen in England that can be adapted globally, and then we will see the impact locally, and we will see the impact globally as well, and the transition to a net nature positive environment.
Great, Fiona, thank you. And I like that you mentioned the mitigation hierarchy, so I can pass it to Tom B. I think it's a very important concept, and there's a big advocacy movement in terms of stopping or willing to stop this kind of offsetting commitment and move very quickly and accelerate the transition towards avoidance. Zero harm and corporate standards that really avoid harm on nature beyond offsetting. So Tom, maybe you can build around that and share with us a little bit more detail on this mitigation hierarchy concept that Fiona shared.
Yeah, so this process of first avoiding impacts, then minimizing and compensating on-site and then off-site, that journey is really important. And it's really important for a number of reasons. Just as we've seen with carbon, and I think, again, I'll draw out those parallels because I think they are useful, it's not going to be possible for us to just carry on business as normal and then assume that we can offset or absorb all of the carbon that we need to. It's physically not possible. And just on that point, it's also very clear that we're not going to meet our net zero targets without ecosystem restoration. So these two have to go together. Exactly the same is true for biodiversity. We must not see any of this work being business as normal, but then we'll put some money elsewhere to deliver some good in another location. You know, we don't want to see the biodiversity requirements in England resulting in offsetting all in one part of England and destroying it all in another. You know, a very practical example of that is that's not only important for the biodiversity, it's also really important for people. You know, if we lose our biodiversity in a poor part of London and put it all into a rich part in the rural environment, that's going to remove a whole load of people's access to nature, which over the last few years we've seen is really, really crucial, especially in those urban areas. And has direct positive impacts on health and well-being as well. So the social impacts of following this mitigation hierarchy are absolutely crucial as well. The other part is that it's much easier to look after what we've got than to restore it. I mean, I love the idea of terraforming Mars, but that's going to be much, much harder than looking after the biodiversity we've got on this planet. And that goes for any of our forests, any of our wetlands. It's much, much easier to look after what we've got already than try and recreate any of it. So this mitigation hierarchy is absolutely crucial and embedded both in the biodiversity net gain work, but also in a lot of the nature positive work as well. We, you know, the fantastic work from Business for Nature and others that we've all been involved with, but also the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. From a UK perspective, we've been trying to help to see how we can play that out across businesses across the UK of all scales, from that sandwich maker to large infrastructure organisations. And the mitigation hierarchy has to be the very heart of that.
And thank you, Tom. Here you raise a very existential question on where to put our hopes. Sometimes it's like we are waiting for the others to act, and then biodiversity is still declining at a very exponential pace. So Roland, we've been discussing in WBCSD and the World Economic Forum between this interplay between regulations and private sector actions and ambitions. Regulations and frameworks are no doubt fundamental, but maybe you can share with us the moment that we're living now in this make it mandatory pledges, nature positive pledges of the business sector, this collective transformation that is coming from the very heart of the private sector and also pushed by a never increasing social activism that we're seeing outside COPs, outside events, and very vigorous non-governmental campaigns. So what are your thoughts about the role of private sector, and how much can we put our hopes also in the corporate sector, private sector, to push the boundaries and work together with government in terms of advancing in parallel pace with frameworks and regulations?
Maybe we can use again that symbol of the ambition loop. The Women in Business Coalition has coined that term a few years ago in the climate process, that indeed leading businesses need to show what is possible to then give the confidence to governments and regulators that they can bring up the floor so that everybody can operate at those same levels. Because, I mean, ultimately we need regulation and legislation so that there is clear expectation for the market. But absolutely, it is also the obligation of business to take that leadership. And especially companies that are operating in many, many different jurisdictions, they first of all need the same levels wherever they invest, because they take global decisions. So if they have to adapt to too many different markets, it adds a lot of complexity and cost. But also, we believe, especially in WBCSD, that it is really the duty of companies with their sustainability ambitions to drive that conversation. But I think the challenge, especially here, is that complexity. And so what we're currently proposing is that we also, especially the built environment, we probably need to cut it into some subsectors, looking at, for example, buildings, looking at urban infrastructure, looking at transport infrastructure, and then coastal and marine environments, because there may be different issues, different pressures, etc., that are needed to be addressed. So I think, again, working together, and some of our work will be on what are those key impacts and pressures that we are working on, what are the risks and opportunities for businesses, and what are the actions they can take, but then bring that into the dialogue with regulators. And for example, especially in the built environment, procurement processes and tendering processes are so important, so that we really have that dialogue. How do we make better decisions from the very start of projects? But I think in some ways we're still at the beginning of really understanding this for nature positive. And so we really need that collaboration, and it would be good to understand what bodies can we also collaborate with on the policy side. So beyond SBTN, beyond TNFD, that help us understand this. How can we actually improve that collaboration also?
Absolutely. And how can you insert in the narratives of different sectors those nature positive standards, even in the pre-procurement and procurement phases? This is fundamental. Maybe, Fiona, we can get a bit more specific here in terms, and you have been working a lot with standards and benchmarks and benchmarking. Can you share some examples of these rural-based enterprises that are doing great things and then can serve as leading or kind of positive lobbying enterprises to show the way towards being really nature positive?
Yes, thanks, Cristina. Yeah, it's a very important point if we draw back to the subject of this webinar itself and link into data. And in particular, the subject of measurement, which is highly complex, as was outlined at the start. It's an important point how complex measurement actually is. What are we measuring and how do we measure it? From an RICS perspective, we have two recent publications challenging ourselves, if you like, and our thinking for the profession on how we approach the subject and how we upskill the profession in order to be able to measure. The first of those was a evaluation of natural capital paper that we did, and that was really trying to upskill and inform the profession on the need for them to expand their thinking on value. As valuers attached to RICS, we do things in a very traditional way, according to an RICS Red Book with very standard basis of value. And certainly in my role, I could see that different concepts of value were emerging and coming into our professional sphere, which was all about natural capital. How do we value natural capital? How should we value natural capital, and why should we value it? And natural capital, there was a lot of work done in the UK on natural capital. We had a committee, we've had natural capital protocols, we've had the emergence of natural capital accounting, and we now know that lots of rural land-based businesses are, in conjunction with doing their financial accounts, are actually doing natural capital accounts. And that's really about looking at their baseline of natural capital at the outset, and then looking at the impacts of decisions on that natural capital base, and whether they're positive or negative, having to look at strategic decision making, opportunity costs, and then really needing to zone in on what is it you want from that land. And if you're looking for the best environmental outcome, then what decisions ought you be making, and what is the net impact on that stock of natural capital that you've outlined in your natural capital accounts. So an interesting paper, and then also looking at the basis of value, which are really economic valuation concepts coming into the professional valuation sphere. And certainly I've seen a lot of rural chartered surveyors in the UK move away from their traditional areas of work and actually are now working in the sphere of natural capital. So we've seen a lot of change in that in the last few years. It's been very positive. We've also done some work on rural benchmarking, and that's looking in particular at a lot of landed estates which we have in Britain, and looking at how they are benchmarking their performance, and again expanding well beyond financial performance and really starting to benchmark their environmental performance. So we've seen a lot in that. There are a lot of benchmarks. I would say there are too many benchmarks. I have some people constantly telling me we've no benchmarks. I think we have the opposite problem. We have a plethora of benchmarks, but we don't have any common benchmarks that everybody has bought into. So we have lots of people measuring their environmental and net nature positive impacts in a very different way, which means that we lose the ability to cross-compare. So there are lots of challenges and issues in that respect from a data perspective. But certainly I've seen a lot of work being done in this area, and we will continue to see it, and we have seen our professionals very heavily engaged with it, which is very positive.
Absolutely. I think that the framework that we've been sharing here helps to kind of channel those benchmarks into one only framework to measure nature positive commitments and transitions. And I like that you mentioned natural capital valuation and economic valuation and how to insert this opportunity cost in decision making. And maybe I'll come back to you, Tom C, regarding this topic. And one of our most recent findings at the World Economic Forum in January this year, we published a report on biodiversities by 2030, which is about reconciling cities' relationship with nature and the urgency of reconciling this relationship, but also the opportunity of transiting towards a more nature positive built environment and how to make it happen in the next decade. And one of our main findings is that there is an enormous investment opportunity in nature-based solutions, yet just 0.3% of current spending on urban infrastructure goes to nature-based solutions or nature-positive infrastructure. So from an infrastructure company or built environment company, where do you think, Thomas, we should move the needle, or what can be the key catalyzer that maybe we're not seeing to accelerate the transition and to make nature-based or nature positive investments a default in the built environment interventions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it comes back to change behavior and how it's perceived. And I think for us, the key is communication, because what we're finding is the drivers now are different. Sustainability used to be low on the agenda, now it's at the top, which it really needs to be. And I think it's seeing that the opportunity in the impact you can have, actually being more community-led, the engagement, the kind of S in the ESG, I think people are starting to understand a bit more and realizing the benefits of engaging with it and putting the time, effort, and money into those topics and seeing the results, sort of being able to report to investors and saying this is the impact we're having is really, really positive. I think it was really important to realize is what Roland was saying is carving up into the different sectors, because they have different challenges and therefore they need different solutions. So if we can get to that change behavior and that mindset change, I think that that's when people will be able to realize actually we can tackle this, we can manage it. So when you start to do that and you actually break it down into a bit more granular detail, you start to understand what you can and cannot do and when. So you can then hit your targets and make sure that they're metricated and you benchmark and you've got your stepping stones, rather than saying, right, we're going to do it all really quickly. And then that, again, coming back to the art of the possible, that becomes really clear and the opportunity then becomes achievable. So I think communication, relying on bodies, we work very closely with Natural England. We work very closely with our clients, their end user, if we're representing a facilities manager or a managing agent. So now it's about getting everyone in the room and having that big, honest, open conversation about what we can actually achieve together. And we're realizing very, very quickly it's a lot. Again, I think sort of touching on what Tom and Roland and Fiona said, I think it's really important and it's positive to see people's mindsets shifting, and therefore we ourselves can actually make the needle change.
Absolutely. Behavioral change. This is very complex again, just how to measure nature, how to measure and drive behavioral change. And this is a question for whoever wants to answer it. How can we first make this more contagious, like this valuation of nature more contagious, and how can we also better screen the cost of inaction? I think that we've been measuring the cost of inaction and the impacts on not conserving nature or not assuming a nature positive pathway, but I think that we still need to do some marketing around the values of nature to drive that positive behavioral change. So whoever wants to answer that, also complex question, but Tom, happy to give you the floor. Tom B, and then Roland.
So there's a lot of good work already that's been done. We've seen the Dasgupta review in England, which was a really useful study led by the government, flagging that we use about 1.6 Earths to maintain our current living standards. We've seen work from the World Economic Forum saying that more than half of global GDP is directly dependent on nature. Of course, the other half is indirectly dependent on nature. Only have to stop eating for a little while to realize that. And the World Bank setting out requirements or setting out papers flagging the risk of the collapse of ecosystems. And then on a very local, much more local scale, there's lots of studies that have been done on. I was involved in one a few years ago looking at the economic impacts of green infrastructure that we produced as part of under DEFRA in the UK. But there's lots of others looking at how businesses need to take biodiversity and nature seriously, because otherwise they're missing a risk to their own business. And by missing that, they're opening themselves up to that risk. And so this is, on one half of this is about decreasing those risks to those businesses. The other half is that they will also be missing those opportunities. We know that nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, whatever we want to call it, nature encourages investment in an area, attracts visitor spending, saves environmental costs, provides health benefits, generates employment. And these are all pieces, I'm not just making this up. This was a study that was done, that was checked by the London School of Economics, run by professionals that understand the economics much better than I do. So we've got the evidence there. And what we need to do is be able to take those to the right people to start communicating that and help businesses become resilient, become what we in WSP, what we call future ready. This is about making sure that we're ready for what's coming down the track so that our businesses thrive through this century, not struggle.
Great. The costs of inaction and future ready. Roland, do you want to complement what Tom shared?
Yeah, just briefly, especially rebouncing on what Fiona mentioned on maybe having too many benchmarks, and it's very complex. I personally come more from the climate discussion, which is very simple if you compare it to nature. We have one metric, and we already struggle with that, just to agree on what do we mean with net zero, and that we really take a system approach to reducing that. And so coming to the nature discussion, which for me is still a learning journey, I am indeed sometimes challenged in my own understanding that what exactly do we need to focus on, and how can we really measure that? So I do think having some real common ground, where we, of course it is more complex and ultimately it's down to the local level as we have discussed, but that we really say in our natural capital accounting, in our NBS strategies, there are a few key things that we all need to do. I think that will be, I'm sorry, I'm mixed up here. That will be critical. And then similarly, how can we make that reflected in valuation? We see some interesting work currently in real estate, looking at the cost of decarbonization and how can that get included in valuation, because today there's no link yet. If you don't invest, you're not penalized by the market. And can we take some of those concepts eventually also to the nature discussion? So how can we make that then relevant in the valuation of projects? Because today we still outsource those externalities. So yes, Tom, there is opportunities for business, but today there is no cost of not doing things. And so that needs to fundamentally change. So a simplified language, and then how do we get that into the valuation? I think it's really what we need to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. Cristina, can I come in there? It's an important point, because certainly our value of natural capital paper linked through to both what Tom B has just said and what Roland said, which is, at the moment, in terms of decision making for businesses, those externalities are not priced in, and we need to arrive at a point where they are priced in. So that's an important point here. I want to go back to what Tom B said, because it concerns values. And certainly, we've done a lot of work on that. And as I said, the natural capital accounts themselves are coming up with very high values. And I just want to raise the point that that can be problematic in its own way, because at the moment we have such a huge divergence between what we term market values, transaction values, and then those values that are being calculated for natural capital stocks, etc. And I think it would be better if we could have some significant kind of merging of those two value systems, if you like, because at the moment they're very separate and the divergence is so big that people can't quite get their heads around it. So, for example, one of our papers has an example just of grasslands in a particular area of England, and we measured some of the cultural and landscape and biodiversity values, and this was just on one grassland in England, and we have 33 million as a starting point, and that is just going to get bigger as you bring in more values, and sometimes those values can just go out of sync completely so that people can't actually grasp them. They become too big. So I'd like to see us sort of focus in, rather than the value itself, you know, some sort of hierarchy, or where are the important values there? So what is it we're looking at? What are the important attributes here that we need to be working on saving, working on maintaining, working on enhancing in order to create the net nature positive environment that we all need and want, rather than it's worth 50 million, but nobody knows where or how the 50 million has been possibly arrived at. I just think it's an important point that we need to be aware of from a practical perspective. And again, it's about pricing in externalities, but they need to be pricing that people can understand.
Absolutely. I like that you mentioned the need to ponder those values and to start with something and to prioritize. So maybe Tom C, from your case, what is like the approach that you're taking towards biodiversity, your companies, including biodiversity kind of perspective in the whole value chain? Where did you start? What did you prioritize first? And what was your first approach towards becoming nature positive?
So we looked at our delivery and tools and equipment and what we can change there. So battery operated tools, battery operated equipment, EV. We've got one of the largest fleets in the UK. And then I think for us, it's that challenge of looking at things slightly differently. So before you would look at the outputs and the results of your equipment, but when you change it to EV, you are waiting for that to be at the same level. However, the cost benefit is slightly different. So depreciation of assets and factoring that into your calculation. So it's not just about quick wins, it's about longevity, and it's about the sustainable cycle of what we're actually delivering out on the ground. So when you're looking at gritting, and we're coming into the cold season now, it's big powered vehicles out there aren't ready to be EV. So you are waiting for innovation and technology to be at that level. But then there's so much else we can do, measuring our carbon, measuring our output, engagement of our people, engagement of our customers and our clients. I think that became really pivotal and crucial, is where we can get lots of opportunity and wins. So that's when we did look at Wildfell and the nature recovery aspect, because we found collaboration was really important and something that we could achieve quite quickly. So with that, we bought our 300-acre farm, and then we started measuring the biodiversity and positive impact we can have. And what we're noticing and seeing is that there are lots of companies working so closely together, not realizing they overlap, and not realizing that they can actually find great opportunity improving the biodiversity at a very, very local level. So I think for us, it's about pushing that, owning that, and being able to say we can offer that added value. That's the added value that we can give. So we were looking at big projects for clients on big pieces of land, where over time that they can phase it, program it, and actually achieve lots of positive results. Everything from the way that they look at their waste, the way that they look at their carbon, then the way that they actually then communicate that out as part of their service offering. So everything's very interlinking, it's very, very complicated. But for us, we want to practice what we speak and deliver that through Wildfell.
Great. Yeah. Localized impact, as Tom B shared at the very beginning. Well, time is running super fast. I don't know if we have some questions from the audience. But if not, I would like to use these minutes for the future thinking that Tombi also introduced. So maybe to each of you, if there was one thing that you could prioritize in the next 6 months to accelerate the transition of nature positive or the nature positive transition in the built environment sector, what would be and why? Who wants to jump in first? Roland.
We have committed to come up in the next 6 months with our baseline paper on what do we mean with nature positive in the built environment, how can we break it down, how can we make it measurable. So I think there is a clear need now also with the CBD starting next week then to build on that. So for us, it's very clear by spring, we'd like to come out with such a paper that we can then discuss more broadly among many stakeholders. Do we agree on broadly, this is how we define it? These are maybe some subsectors to look at. These are the main impacts we need to clarify. So I think for us, everything should happen tomorrow. We were hoping to have already more for this CBD next week, but given the complexity of the nature and also making sure businesses are on board, we're taking a bit more time, but by spring, we hope to come out with a bit more work in this area. So that's our commitment.
So we're going to have an announcement that the UN Water Conference may be on nature positive commitments in March.
Is that in March? Okay, yeah, we'll try.
Fiona, Tom C, Tom B, any future thinking?
My expertise is in rural and land, but in terms of the built environment, obviously I work for RSCS, so I'm aware of initiatives that happen across the other disciplines within the profession as well. So in terms of property and construction and infrastructure delivery in particular, I do know that we have standards on embodied carbon and that we're updating it. So I'd like to see an obligation coming through that everybody involved in the construction and infrastructure sectors measures their embodied carbon and does so in the same way so that there is ability for cross comparison within the industry. That would be my number one.
Great. Tom B.
So I think strong, clear targets coming out of COP are really important. And just to echo what was said earlier, I think Fiona was flagging this point, that the biodiversity net gain work ran in England and the UK because business got behind it first, and then government said, yes, that's a great idea. I don't mean to be unfair to government, but I think business was really leading that. And I think there's an opportunity here for businesses to do exactly the same on nature positive, to demonstrate what good looks like, especially against that target 15 that's in the COP text, which is around impacts, reporting on impacts that businesses have. And what that means is setting out a standard approach, even if we don't know exactly how we're going to report on all of it, how we're going to deal with all of it, setting out a standard approach for businesses. And that's what we're trying to do within the UK, setting out that we need to run materiality assessments, set targets, deliver on that, report on that, and then also ratcheting up those targets. Because just, I think Roland was saying, let's do the easy things now. Let's do it and get those low-hanging fruit and act on it, and then build on that over time. And that comes back to a point that was said earlier again, and I can't remember exactly who, but the importance of collaboration across the business sector is vital. And so we're trying to draw together a whole load of businesses to help to think about this and help shape how this moves forward. So yeah, I'm really excited about this next year. I think that's my number one thing for next year: strong, clear targets, and then collaboration to deliver nature positive outcomes.
Wonderful, and the role of science in it. Tom C.
I think for me, it's really realizing the severity of not doing anything and understanding that we just can't do that. So I think, like you said, some collaboration engagement. I would love a group of an advisory board, and that's what we're trying to instigate at Ground Control within our sector of individuals getting together and learning from each other and realizing, right, what can we do as a group? Because I think together we can do more and be stronger. So going forward is just realizing that we can't sit still and actually realizing the impact we can have when we work together.
Absolutely. Great. Well, time flies and we are almost over. I just want to thank you, Roland, Tom, Fiona, and the other Tom for a great conversation. Lots of insight here. I think that we are all ready for a second round and looking forward to meeting you again soon. I would like to remind our audience that RISC will soon publish the recording and written summary of this webinar, as well as the presentation online. So we welcome you to visit their website. And you can find there not only these material, but future webinars, as well as previous sessions that you might have missed. Join also the next seminars on 7th and 14th of December. The 7th of December, we will be talking about transforming land use, delivering a vibrant and sustainable economy, and then closing the year with a year in review. And there's also the World Built Environment Forum Week in the second week of January, from the 16th to the 20th of January 2023. This is the RICS Global Conference looking at sustainable placemaking in a net zero resilient world. The conference will be held virtually, and you can have here the QR code to register. We invite you to join all these events and to keep the discussion going on how to drive nature positive transitions in the built environment. That was all from my side as well. I wish you all a great end of the day, and thank you again to the great panelists to share your insights and hopes on nature positive transition.